Okay, so I'm going to talk actually not about privacy at all. I'm going to talk about standards. So my background, I'm a professor at the University of Essex, professor of internet law, and my interest is actually in where law meets regulation and where regulation meets standards. So it's very much interdisciplinary work. I worked a lot with Jonathan, as we may get to tell you about later in the week, on aspects of what we call co-regulation, as well as self-regulation involving the internet, both from the content perspective and also from the technical perspective. And I've also worked a lot with Ian Brown. In fact, Ian and I have a book coming out next year, which we think is an internet science book. It will be the first internet science book, called Regulating Code. And that's going to be published by MIT Press. So that's going to come out in about February next year. So at the moment, whenever we see any major development happening in privacy or online networking or network neutrality, we get terribly nervous because the book is now in press. So we have 6 months for the world to change and make the book irrelevant. Hopefully that won't happen. And I've also worked, I mentioned network neutrality. I wrote a book in 2010 on network neutrality, which was published by the Harry Potter publisher, Bloomsbury. Although you can also get a PDF online of that book because it's a Creative Commons license book, in addition to obviously being a thumping great hardback. And a book last year with Cambridge Press called Internet Co-Regulation, which actually develops the project that Jonathan and Ian and I were working on a couple of years ago for the Commission. So for those of you who are in the social sciences, there's probably various things in there which would be of interest, I think. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, bear in mind, my background is law and then social science broadly. So you're going to hear, about 2/3, I think I was writing it down, about 2/3 of you are computer scientists. So you're going to get quite a social science perspective in this first talk. So bear with me. If I say something that sounds like absolute gibberish, that could be two things. Either it's an interdisciplinary misunderstanding, or it's actually absolute gibberish, right? So there's two possibilities. So please do ask, because it's important to work out which one of those it is. It's probably too late for me. I'm far too old to actually stop talking gibberish at this point, but you'll be able to save yourselves. Okay, so with that, let's move on. I'm going to talk about the new thing when it comes to internet standards and governance. And I want the talk, I think probably all of you, particularly those of you who are computer scientists, have a background in standards. You work in standards all the time because you can't not work in standards when you're doing the work that you're doing. So this is going to be a relatively advanced talk. I'm going to try and get through some of the basics fairly quickly. But I want to start actually by talking about, oh, hello. Hello. Oh, how do we get rid of the ink option?
And you click down the PowerPoint icon to come back to the PowerPoint.
Chris, you have a magic finger, obviously. Ah, okay. So we need to start again.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah. Click into action. Oops. There we go. All right, now we should be back on. There we go. So I just want to give you a brief introduction to internet science anyway. Why are we actually exploring internet? Why are you here today? Why are we exploring internet science? And what we're looking at is basically trying to move beyond a monodisciplinary approach, whether it's computer science or other areas, to think about internet development within the fact that it's both a societal as well as a technological artifact. It's fascinating to me how many of you are taking computer science PhDs or postdoctoral work looking at online social networking and not looking at it purely from a computer architecture perspective, but looking at the interaction of human and technological artifacts. So what we're looking for, of course, is a deeper multidisciplinary understanding. And you are the first guinea pigs of this, right? This week, this workshop is the first internet science workshop as a summer school. And within that, in terms of the expected outputs, I should emphasize this is a 3.5-year project, so we're not output focused yet, but we will become so. We hope that what we can come up with as a result of hopefully gaining a deeper understanding of how internet architecture affects society and vice versa, that we can come up with evidence and with policy that helps to support political choices that are being made, particularly within Europe when it comes to A, funding research, but B, actually the development of the relationship between the internet and society. And I think when Ralph was talking about, well, I'm doing this research because someone's got to do this research, well, that's one of the drivers that we have. It's obvious that there is a melding of technological and political goals in some of what we're doing. And also helping to with economic, social, and environmental objectives. So one of the areas that we're exploring, as you'll see, is about a greener internet and how the internet can contribute towards environmental protection, or otherwise. It may turn out the internet is well, we shall see how server farms are helping the environment as we go forward. Okay, this is the partners. Most of you are familiar with this because most of you are from various of the partners, but we have a total, I believe, of 37. Anna will know the actual count on this. I believe 37 including the advisory board, perhaps. Is that right?
It's 33 in the consortium, and the advisory board, it's another 4 or 5.
Right, so somewhere in the kind of 37, 38 range. You will see yourselves there somewhere, I'm sure. We have Korea and Beijing and NICTA. Oops, that's interesting. Oh, I've just realised.
You've got a magic finger too.
I can't actually, I've just realised, I can't gesture at the board without it doing things. So allow me, if I point, I'm going to point like this. Right, that's safe. And various others, so you'll see is all there. Obviously a concentration in Europe, but also from other places as well, including, for instance, the University of Waterloo in Canada. Okay, so this is the construction of the overall project. We have a range of joint research activities. I'm being very careful as I point. A range of joint research activities on the left-hand side, from virtual communities, which will fit in with some of the social networking projects that you're engaged in. Internet as critical infrastructure, Internet for sustainability. The project I'm going to talk about in the next hour or so, which is governance, regulation, and standards. But then the one that you will all be focused on this week, which is Internet privacy, identity, trust, and reputation. And then 3 overarching joint research activities at the bottom. The JRA1 is towards a theory of Internet science. I'm not actually engaged in that myself, but I'm going to find out more about it this week because Kaveh Salmation, who some of you will know, is going to be along at the end of the week and is actually leading that effort. Or if he's not leading that effort, he seems to be certainly the most active in that effort. Emerging theories and design methodologies, which is being led, I believe, from Cambridge. I think Dirk is leading that project, Dirk Trossen, who some of you will know. And then evidence and experiment, about which more will be said later, no doubt, because I don't have anything to say about it now. Then there are integration activities, facilitation of research and mobility, which is something which is a work in progress that obviously will develop as we go through the 3.5 years of the project. Joint courses and graduate programs, which are being developed, and summer schools. And I shall say no more about summer schools because you're all here. And then finally, we have spreading excellence. We have e-presence. Of course, we have not only a fabulous website, but also other tools that we're developing. Standardization in legislation. There is going to be a feed forward and hopefully a feed backward from the work we're doing on regulation and standards towards work that we're doing in terms of actually talking to policymakers about the use of those standards. And I should say, even though I'm not going to talk much about privacy in my talk, obviously things like privacy by design as well as other elements of privacy obviously involve standards. I think that's probably clear to all of us. And so some of the ongoing work within, for instance, the IETF, hopefully will have an influence taken from some of the work that we're doing here. So there will be, this is not just an experimental kind of fishbowl. There will actually be real-world impacts of the work that we're doing within the network of excellence. I don't know if that's inspiring or scary. I hope it's both. It should be. And finally, there are open calls. So one of the elements of this project, which was very important and which the Commission was very happy about, is the fact that not all of the money is allocated for the project, for all of the projects yet, because we kept back a sum of money, knowing that obviously this is a dynamic and developing area, for further calls going forward. So if you have inspiration and if you have an engagement with one of the partners, and of course there are, after all, 33 partners, so you'll have an engagement with one of them, then there is the possibility of actually looking for further research or further dissemination activities as well coming out of this as we go forward. And there's quite a few coming up. In fact, Jonathan, I need to share, John Crowcroft and I had a brainstorming last week which produced some fabulous stuff. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to mention something about ethics and why lawyers are involved in this. As I said, I'm a professor of law. I direct the Essex Centre for Comparative and European Law. And I'm doing two things. I'm leading two joint research activities. The first is governance, regulation and standards, and I've mentioned my particular interests. I should say that one of those things which I haven't mentioned yet, but which we'll develop, is the idea that standard setting is an alternative form of regulation. So there is a very narrow legal respect in which you can look at regulation, in which you claim that regulation is only valid if it involves enforcement, and that, of course, lawyers think that enforcement has to go through courts. But, of course, those of us from a more technical background will say, well, in actual fact, standards themselves regulate the behaviors that we engage in, because one cannot usefully write a protocol that doesn't match with the standard that it has to interoperate with, because you simply don't achieve any implementation of the work that you're carrying out. So standard setting is a mode of regulation. Standard setting regulates the way in which we work towards future internet architecture. So I like a broader version of standards than simply something that says, if it doesn't involve courts, we're not interested in it. So I'm not going to talk to you today about, well, I'm hoping not to talk too much to you today about the Apple-Samsung fight over patents and those kinds of standards. That kind of thing is pretty much core legal work. There's plenty of published work on it. There are people who know more about it than I do. I can refer you to the literature, but I don't think that would interest you greatly, particularly given that a lot of that is actually a whole, well, Jonathan was talking about this last night. There's a whole series of interesting kind of game theoretical approaches to why Apple is suing Samsung in one court and why Samsung is suing Apple in another, and the different jurisdictions they're using. It's all interesting from a legal perspective. What it has to do with innovation is something that we can discuss later. Okay, and then the other, I will just say briefly about virtual communities, which is the other joint research activity which I'm leading. And it's fascinating from a legal perspective to look at virtual communities and social networks because of the creation of control regimes. Because we're not working in a bottom-up, we generate all the rules and they feed through into some kind of anarchic but beautiful state of equilibrium in which we have an agreement about how we're going to follow the rules in our world. Right? That would be wonderful if it wasn't for the fact that there is a publisher, an owner of the world that we tend to engage in, and that publisher or owner is actually cascading from the top down the kind of rules that we're engaged in. So, the idea that the users of Facebook are the generators of the regulation of Facebook is interesting and probably not an accurate description of how Mr. Zuckerberg sees his property actually developing. So that's very useful. And it used to be considered, I should say that a lot of mainstream lawyers are very snotty about the idea of virtual communities. They're very, they tend to say, well, what's this really got to do with the law? And of course, a lot of lawyers have been working in this area for very many years. There's some wonderful work that was done on Second Life and Napster by Victor Meyer-Schonberger, who's a professor here. Now, I think 9 years ago, his seminal article in the area. And Lawrence Lessig, another lawyer who some of you will be familiar with, wrote about this stuff in the mid-1990s, and it goes further back than that even. But of course, Facebook, and the fact that Facebook is such a valuable property, of course its value is fluctuating. Actually, fluctuating would suggest it's going up and down. Its value is altering, but nevertheless, it is a very large property and therefore is of great interest. And the fact that it has, well, of course, people said it was approaching 1 billion users, and then they looked at all the duplicated and fake accounts, and we now have a slightly different idea of how big it is. It makes life very interesting, and it makes it much more reputable for a lawyer to actually be engaged in this kind of work. So to all of you, it's fascinating. To me, I can feel professionally comfortable with the fact I'm looking at it. I'm no longer sneered at. Okay, so that's that. I've already, I think, talked about most of these things, so I'm just going to skip forward to just talk about disciplinary approaches to this. I want to say something about why it's so important from a legal perspective to look at this in the round, to look at standards as well as regulation, as well as law. And it's very well understood, I think, by policymakers now that regulation and governance has become an essential part of the way that the internet architecture operates. We can no longer think that this is a technical artifact, if we ever thought this. We can no longer think that this is a technical artifact in which politicians and regulators can have no part to play. And that's for good and bad. So, there was a kind of meme around 20 years ago which was suggesting that somehow if the politicians stayed out of the way, then the internet would develop successfully and that we could solve all our problems without any political interference. And I think that certainly as you come to develop your discussions about privacy this week, you're going to more and more talk about how government can actually, ideally, set rules which are actually privacy enhancing, and that if you left this to technical architecture, that some of the technical architects might not have our best privacy interests at heart, as well as those who are trying to enhance privacy. Yeah? So the idea that government does have a legitimate, if dangerous, role to play in the creation of a better regime. And that's a legislative role as well as juridical, to use a legal term. So this isn't just about the courts trying to solve disputes, which is, I think, how a lot of black letter lawyers tend to look at the law, but also about the way in which we create a legislative environment. And so it won't have escaped your attention, those of you engaged in the privacy field, that of course we have a data protection regime which is currently being altered through an extraordinary kind of semi-public process. And we're going to be coming up at the end of it with a data protection regulation which will affect the way not just in which European companies operate, but the way in which any company which has business in Europe operates, which means any company, more or less. Any company with certainly any international ambitions. And so one of the fascinations about this is there's a kind of melding here of law and political science when you look at the creation of new legislation and the way in which that policy process works. Second part about that is about standards. There is a very basic role for law in standards, which is to do with antitrust, to do with the fact that when companies come together to create a standard, they are, of course, engaging in a kind of cartel behavior, and therefore they have to be careful that they don't fall foul of competition rules. And that applies not just to companies working together as a group, but also potentially to companies actually working individually and creating their own standards. So if a company is large enough and has a dominant enough share of its particular market, then the creation of a new standard which fails to interoperate with others can become very controversial. And at this point you might think of Microsoft, but you could also think of some of the recent work that Apple is engaged in, and I'm sure we have plenty of other companies we could talk about, from SAP to many other companies. So it's not necessarily Sun, another good example. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about Java a little later on. So we can think of lots of areas in which that's important. And clearly, standards are intellectual property. The use of standards are the use of intellectual property and abuse of intellectual property. And so clearly what I talked about earlier, the kind of Apple-Samsung type battle, and the idea about the way in which you use patents defensively and offensively, the way in which they're licensed is, of course, very important. So this is kind of shedding a legal light on things. And again, from virtual world perspectives, it's just fascinating to see the way in which people try and talk about the constitution of a virtual world, as if there is somehow a way in which you can write a new form of ordering that would affect the way in which we operate virtually as opposed to in the physical space, in the meat space. And the legal framework around that. And what's very interesting there is just the fact that when you go, whether it's onto Facebook or World of Warcraft or almost any virtual world you can think of, your relationships, they're really governed by contract law. So you can have some great highfalutin philosophical claim of, oh yes, this is a new constitution. Well, how do you like a constitution formed by contract? And when I say by contract, when you engage into these things, when you log on to the University of Oxford website, it's about their terms of use, and there is no negotiation taking place. So if this is a constitution, it's a constitution of a very different country to one that I'm used to living in. And the type of social contract in the kind of Rousseau sense is rather different to one in which there's a negotiated outcome. Okay, so let's focus particularly. Any questions at this point? I've given you quite a broad kind of landscape. People are either comfortable or are politely disinterested, and those are both good things. So, all right, so internet standards. Why do I say new, new, new? Well, let's just start with the new first. Internet standards as a new paradigm to challenge the existing way of making standards are really exemplified in the Internet Engineering Task Force and the way in which you can have a technocratic mode of decision making which doesn't rely upon a direct connection with government. And so the idea is, and this famous phrase used by David Clark, who's just received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Oxford Internet Institute. Of course, his Lifetime Achievement is, in many ways, the IETF itself. Rough consensus and running code. We do not believe in kings and presidents. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And the idea is that the way in which protocols are developed through the IETF is a more efficient, a more flexible, and a faster implemented system. And the mode of enforcement of an IETF standard, of course, is the fact that people use the thing. And there is work being done now, I suppose there's continuous work being done, on how many of the IETF standards are actually effective in terms of actually being implemented or not. How many orphaned or dead standards do we have out there? And the answer is at least dozens, if not hundreds. And the fact that they've not been implemented is the mode of enforcement. They simply have not been used. And some of those are very important and are very much underused. And you can think, for instance, of multicasting as a very interesting example of a protocol which has got a very long history and is very little implemented. I'm feeling a warm heat coming out of the panel here, and I'm sure that's a good thing. I'm not quite sure why that would happen with air conditioning, but anyway. Okay, and this is me attempting to be provocative and hoping that you're going to argue with me. This claim about, oh, well, we don't need kings and presidents, we have rough consensus and running code, led to a claim that there could be a constitution of cyberspace as if it was divorced from meat space. And so we have a former lyricist for the Grateful Dead, John Perry Barlow, deciding that somehow there is something uniquely different about the internet, which means that we don't need to follow the rules that have been followed in previous environments. And I say that's silly because I think there's a very long history of a kind of claims of techno-independence, claims of some kind of techno-panacea. And these stretch right back through technologies, from radio to, well, you could go way back. You could actually go back to shipping and many, many older forces than that. And I think that probably we should establish as a baseline that the internet is not separate from the real world space, and that real world rules do apply to the internet, even if they're not very well applied. Jonathan.
In the spirit of provocation,
Mm-hmm.
John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence was that. It was a Declaration of Independence. It wasn't a constitution and it wasn't a Bill of Rights. Believing that you have your hands on something new is a necessary first step to collective action. These are mistakes. As John Crowcroft will tell you, the internet was never intended for deployment. It was an experiment that got out of hand and continues to remain out of hand.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should be too harsh. Now, I'm not sure if the word silly constitutes as harshness, but you mentioned the other pre-existing technologies. Maritime law, for example, still shapes all of our insurance law. These silly old cases from the 17th century still determine the principles about what is and isn't in the contract.
Yep.
So I think that this idea of entirely transitory things having very long-term consequences and being entirely disproportionate to their real weight is exactly meat and drink. And
Oh, absolutely.
relax about it.
And there are comparisons you can make between internet law and maritime law, or internet law and the law of space. There's a very interesting book, which is now 11 years old, by Deborah Spar, who was a professor at Harvard Business School and is now the dean of, is it Barnard College, the Columbia's sister institution? And she wrote a book which has got various names in various different countries. But it's basically, I think, the idea behind it is pirates, prophets with a PH, and pioneers. And it's about the way in which new spaces form and the way in which rules become institutionalized. And the way in which the various pirates, and she goes back, when she says pirates, she's thinking of pirates in the kind of Middle Ages, Age of Discovery, as well as the more modern kind of Sean Fanning and so on, and Kim.com form of pirates. So if you want some background on that, I think hers is a very interesting historical perspective on it. And she goes through Mr. Murdoch and satellite television as well, to give you another kind of recent technology. So yeah, point absolutely taken. And this discussion about the constitution of cyberspace has been taken up actually by legal academics based on the work that was done there. In fact, Johnson and Post is probably the classic example of taking this, which was a description of a potential ideal world, and trying to give it legs in terms of making it a kind of constitutional legal reality, as if governments should keep their hands off cyberspace. So there's an original argument which is governments cannot control cyberspace, which of course is increasingly untrue, and that then became transcended into a kind of normative argument that governments should not touch cyberspace, that there was a kind of delicate flower of freedom which should not be touched. And we can have a discussion about how much that should and shouldn't be true from a normative perspective, as well as a discussion about the practical realities. And I think that if you're going to talk about privacy all week, then of course you're going to be talking about the degree to which control exists with the user, with companies trying to collect that private information, and of course with governments that may or may not be mediating between the two, and of course may be captured by one or the other, or both. I think that's probably unlikely. Okay, so thank you. That's the kind of response to the provocation that I like.
You could actually, just as a final remark on that, take the word private and introduce the word privateer. Because one of the ways in which governments exert influence, if not control, is by pretending not to be governments. And using as agents people who believe they're doing civil society, right? But are actually, shopping people, collecting information on them, doing various things, or punishing them through cyber attacks and whatnot.
Yes.
For good purposes. So the government doesn't own the good purposes, but it can certainly use them as a way of co-opting people.
Yeah, and I think we're all familiar with the kind of subtle ways in which companies and governments interact. And one of the fascinations, of course, in this space, particularly when you're looking at different stakeholders, I think you were talking about the different stakeholders and how they work together, is the fact that people can be representing various different stakeholders at various different times. And you will come across people who, of course, can be representing a government or a company or civil society, depending upon what they choose to represent as coming out of their mouth at any one time. And the Internet Governance Forum is a wonderful chance to see people swapping the hat that they're wearing at any one time. So yeah, point very well taken. This is a messy kind of soup of stakeholders, and that's one of the things that makes it particularly interesting. And one of the things, by the way, which makes this interesting not just for itself as Internet governance, Internet regulation is fascinating, but interesting for people studying regulation more broadly. So people studying, I don't know, standards for sewage contamination in rivers could get a lot of lessons from Internet design, simply because what's happening in the Internet is like a little kind of centrifuge accelerating all of the normal regulatory processes and creating very kind of messy alliances. And so what's happening here, this is a little, it's not just a laboratory in terms of the degree of technological evolution taking place on the Internet, but it's also a laboratory in terms of the amount of regulatory innovation taking place as well. And so it's actually rather interesting for those studying regulation from a kind of broader perspective. Okay, so this is telling you what we're actually doing within the actual research that we're carrying out within Internet science. And one of the important things that we're doing is actually creating a repository of standards body case studies, because obviously if you're trying to look at the way in which standards work properly, you have to try to achieve a measure of what is successful governance. Not just the design of a protocol, but the way in which the protocol design was arrived at, and the way it's implemented, and the way it's enforced, and of course the way in which it's reformed. You know, there's a kind of life cycle of the way in which protocols operate. And so what we're coming up with within that is a living catalogue of standards bodies and their functions. And we want to not just look at Internet standards, but look at standards that are converging onto the Internet from telecoms, and look at the interplay and the trade-offs that happen between the various bodies responsible for these standards and the design choices that they're making. And so the kind of idea we're looking at is the contrast between the ITF model, remember this is the rough consensus running code model, the ETSI model. ETSI is the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, which has a weighted majority voting model for those companies that are members of ETSI. Confusingly, ETSI uses something called the new method of standard setting, but the new method is from the early 1990s. It's always very dangerous to call anything the new, because of course 20 years later it's still called the new at a time when it's no longer the new. But nevertheless, it's called the new method of standard setting. In the same way as in European governance, we have a new method of coordination, which is now 15, 20 years old as well. And then the final model that's worth just thinking about, and which I'll talk about briefly here, is the World Wide Web Consortium model, which I'm going to provoke you with some thoughts about how it works today and how it used to work in the past.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Why are, for example, industry standardization processes missing, like OASIS or Liberty Alliance, who, well, okay, in my opinion, they all failed, but might still be nice to have them as a comparison why they failed.
We will use them. Is this? Yes, there we are. So these are some of the standard case studies that we're generating. And in fact, of those, you're quite right, that we focused a little bit too much on the kind of classic, how should I put it, the long-established standards bodies. But at the bottom, at least, we have the 3GPP. And in particular, its work on the IP multimedia subsystem, which is a controversial and interesting example of an industry, of a standard originally led by a very specific industry sector, namely the mobile companies. So that's a kind of example of the kind of thing you're talking about. I was about to issue, actually, an open invitation, which is that for those of you who do have knowledge of either literature on or actually the workings of particular case studies from standards that you think might be interesting for us, then please do feel free to email me with some of the thoughts you have about what might be interesting case studies or case studies that are already out there. Obviously, there are thousands of examples of standards that we can look at. There are hundreds of examples of bodies that we can look at. And I think that one of those that's particularly interesting are these slightly ephemeral standards, coalitions that form and dissolve, and that maybe dissolve and form again into some other type of coalition or single company standard, or migrate into some other kind of form of standard forming. So, these are not, one of the important things I think about looking at standards is not to try and look at them completely in isolation, but to recognize the kind of the environment, the ecology in which they operate, and to understand where they go to. So just to give you an idea going through these, the IETF, of course, is the first one that we looked at. And we've kind of had a look at the general constitution of the IETF and how it operates. The time period in which this was carried out was 2006 to 7, and this was, in fact, some work that Ian Brown was doing within this co-regulatory study that we carried out for the Commission at the time. And one of the interesting things that we wanted to look at was the degree to which the IETF is itself, to some degree, and I don't want to overstress this, but to some degree, as it grows, and some of you might be familiar that the IETF's meetings are getting larger and larger and larger, and more and more and more international, and with a higher and higher degree of involvement of corporates with a slightly more perhaps obvious taste than they did previously, the degree to which there might be a kind of convergence of outcome in terms of speed of creation of a standard between the IETF and even the ITU. And so this is something that we at least want to look at. I'm not suggesting that they are equally efficient, you can use the word efficient or turn it around, or equally bogged down in particular processes, but I want to suggest that there is an interesting difference between the IETF as it was originally created and the IETF as it is now, particularly for more controversial standards. And by controversial, I simply mean standards in which there are differing opinions on whether the standard should be adopted or not. So multicasting is a mid-1990s example, but also the way in which, and here's something which will be interesting for you for the rest of the workshop, I'm sure, to think about the way in which certain IETF standards have become very controversial because of their privacy implications, and the degree to which that has meant that some of these standards have actually ended up being talked and talked and talked and talked, but actually never finally reached the RFC point because there were serious concerns about, for instance, the privacy implications associated with them. And some of you will be more expert on this.
RFC is? Request for comments.
Yeah. So that's the kind of the baseline document that you use for a standard for the IETF, with which I think almost everyone in the room is more familiar than me because you work with these every day. Okay. Second is ETSI. ETSI is, as I say, the European Telecom Standards Institute. There is some very controversial work carried out, and I want to give a little bit of a health warning with this about the way in which ETSI helped to generate the 3G standards that became the UMTS standard, which Universal Mobile Telecom Standard, I believe is what it stands for, which is the basic 3G standard. That was an amalgamation of European standards and US standards. And there's been a lot of work carried out criticizing ETSI for the work it was doing. I should warn you, a lot of the critical work, particularly when it's US generated, was funded by Qualcomm, which is not a disinterested party in the 3G standard development. But it's very interesting. And ETSI, in contrast to the rough consensus of running code, is a weighted majority voting institution. So members such as Ericsson and others will have a weight of votes within ETSI in the way in which it operates. Third model, World Wide Web Consortium. Again, I did some work on this, looking at the general constitution and the development of the World Wide Web. One particular privacy standard, which is of course of interest, is P3P, which was a very controversial standard, which has not really gathered much ground, but there was an attempt in the mid-1990s to overcome the problem of cookies, the 1995 European Data Protection Regulation, and what should be done about this within web standards. And the W3C itself says, I don't want to shock anybody, but the whole idea behind the W3C is that there is an enlightened dictator who runs the W3C. And that dictator is the very unlikely figure for a dictator of Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And Sir Tim's vote is final when it comes to these things. If he decides something shouldn't be a standard, it doesn't become a standard. But within that, it also has corporate members, about 450 now. And those corporate members are really responsible for the direction and the drive of it, but within this kind of enlightened dictator model. So it's a very interesting model and deliberately designed to be not exactly the opposite, but to work in a very different way to the IETF. You had a thought?
Yeah, my thought was that they actually lost about HTML5 because that was not driven by the World Wide Web Consortium in the end.
Right. And this is one of the fascinating case studies from the recent history of the W3C.
The W3's idea was much better from a technological point of view, but HTML5 was adopted by industry.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yeah. And which is interesting because it demonstrates a couple of things. First of all, it demonstrates that this cannot be an entirely corporately captured standards body, because if it was so, you would hope that, or you would perhaps expect the corporate interest to drive it through. On the other hand, you might argue that because of the difference in opinion between different corporates, that's why it ended up going outside the W3C. And that's the kind of thing that we're exploring at the moment. IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, particular case study which I think is particularly interesting is the formation of the 802.11 standards, and particularly the way in which 802.11 was implemented and was accepted by industry both in North America and in Europe, and of course overwhelmed what was then in place a rather better standard, or a rather better formed standard, which was Hyperlan and then Hyperlan 2, which were the European standards in place at the time, which have effectively never been manufactured there's never been manufacturing to that standard. The ITU, particularly interesting example is the way in which the negotiation is taking place at the moment. The international telecom treaties were last negotiated in 1988, the baseline treaty. There is a negotiation going on at the moment. I put a star next to the person who's going to be investigating that, because of course this is going to be a case study which we can generate currently, because of course the developments are taking place now. Question about governance reforms. The ITU has opened up and become a consensus-driven multi-stakeholder environment, so it claims. And so the question is about the emperor's new clothes and how different they are to the old clothes when it comes to the way in which the ITU operates. But there are also interesting elements about the ITU and its relationship with the IETF and with other standards bodies and the way in which that's developing. And in fact, of course, it's only in the last 3 years that the ITU has formally recognized the fact that it needs to work with IETF and W3C. And that's because of government opposition. And for those of you who don't know, of course, the ITU is the intergovernmental organization. It's an agency of the United Nations driven by governments. So a very different, well, formally driven by governments, although in fact corporate actors do most of the work within the standards bodies, but at least formally driven by governments. So a very different environment to the others. And then going to the kind of core of how standards work, it's also important to look at the International Standards Organization, which is the kind of the great granddaddy of all standards organizations, has particularly interesting relationships with the particular case study of Java. Ooh, I did it again, didn't I? Yeah. And now we're going forward, not back. Yeah, did. Without fully revealing the details of the standard, were opposed at the time by the government of China, which was willing to stand up against Sun with the US government's support within ISO. So again, a very interesting standard story because it's perhaps, to some people, it might be the opposite of what you expect, but which is very, very interesting. And the agendas that are being driven here are fascinating. And in fact, the Java saga continues to this day because Java has continued to be a controversial standard.
I think 3 or 4 years ago, Microsoft decided to let the ISO standardize some open document format.
Yes.
Did you compare that, or?
That's what I'm going to mention that in a second because the experiences of Sun and Microsoft in front of ISO are particularly interesting. And in fact, one of the things we want to do is to speak to the people inside ISO processes, because one of the fascinations is the way in which the ISO, these are people who do standards every day of the week across all kinds of standards, the fascination of the difference in language and the difference in approach between people working on ISO standards and people working on internet-only standards. And the kind of well, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, ISO people have the impression that people working on internet standards are kind of amateurs when it comes to standards diplomacy, that they don't have a full appreciation of what it means to be working within the standards environment in general. And so it's very interesting to see this difference between people who are focused on internet standards and people who work across the standards environment. And by the way, I should say, you know, it wouldn't be repeatable, but people working in internet standards have a very different perspective of what they think of the ISO way of working. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that's kind of the reverse opinion. So yeah, no, that's a very important comparison to make. Within ICANN, there's some wonderful work that was done by Milton Mueller and colleagues at the University of Syracuse, looking at DNSSEC and how DNSSEC was implemented. Yes?
There's one question or comment I just can't hold back. So
no, go ahead.
I'm thinking about ISO and I'm thinking about the DNS because, well, the country code top-level domains are based on an ISO standard. And then again, they were proposed by the IETF, and its implementation, therefore, is sort of organized by the ICANN. Are you researching the interrelation between the standard setting bodies and how they are using different standards originating from different groups with the ISO standard for the International Post Union, and then that being transferred into the TLDs and that being implemented by the ICANN?
Two-part answer.
Yep.
First part is, and the danger when you present an overview is that people say, this guy's doing all of this standards work at once? Which the answer is no. And on that part, that's Lee Bygrave in the University of Oslo, who, of course, we lean on heavily when it comes to the work on ICANN, because, of course, we have someone here from Oslo. Right. So, yes. So ICANN, I cannot, but Lee can. So that's the first part answer. And the second part answer is that, of course, we are piggybacking on a lot of published work as well. So although we don't yet have a formal relationship with Milton and the Syracuse people, there is a wonderful book which was just published called Open Standards, which is edited by Laura Donadis from Yale. And we can, of course, piggyback on a lot of standards work that's already been done. Because certainly, for those of you who are not familiar, this sounds incredibly ambitious. And I should say we don't have the kind of level of funding that enables us to do a lot of fresh research and case studies from the start, hence my open call to people to say, please help us to gather this standards work that we're trying to do. So, of course, we rely upon a lot of published work as well. But if you have a lot of knowledge in that area, this is something we should discuss in Oslo next week.
I'm just thinking that this is very schematical and this is really comprehensible and comprehensive. But then in practice, they are all intertwined.
Yes,
so
exactly.
So if you're just using your simple, .pl country code top-level domain, it seems it's that simple, but it's not. When you're looking at standards, they're all intertwined. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a really great idea that you're doing that.
And of course, the danger is trying to silo any of these and say, well, we can look in isolation at this without looking at this. And of course, what's interesting is the interrelationship between them. Right. And then, of course, what's even more interesting is the implementation of these standards, the degree to which they're taken up, and the enforcement of these standards as well. So, which is one of the reasons why the Java experience with ISO was so interesting, because the extent to which Sun thought that they could basically make Java into a standard and still be able to enforce their interpretation of it via US courts was something which governments found fascinating and a very interesting idea. And then the IP multimedia subsystem is particularly, John Vaclavsky from Cisco did a lot of work on IP multimedia subsystem in the early days. It's fascinating because, of course, one of the interesting things about this is the generation of standards for quality of service for the mobile internet beginning in 1999. So beginning long, long before the idea of, before the word, the expression net neutrality was used. And the idea that one could turn back this particular standards coalition by simply saying, well, we have a political will not to implement this would be, well, interesting. I don't think you can turn back the tide that easily. Okay, so the benevolent dictatorship, just to kind of briefly go through this. By the way, someone needs to shout when it's 11 o'clock, because I can just talk for the entire day. So what time do we have, Jonathan?
20 to 11.
20 to 11? Okay, so I can probably get through this. OOXML is thrown in here, and so I'm glad that you mentioned it. So a claim that is made, I'm not making this claim, it's a claim that has been made by people closer to the W3C than I, is that the W3C has, the claim is that it's sunk into a corporatist capture. That because it's funded by and effectively to a very large extent its agenda is shaped by the corporate interests who are members of the W3C, that therefore this is really something which is there to adopt standards which are in the interest of the particular large corporates who have time to engage in the process. But then you have issues that suggest that maybe that isn't working in quite this kind of cliched corporatist capture way, which are, for instance, the adoption of OOXML standards, the most interesting from your point of view for this week's standard, which is P3P, which never really became adopted properly, and the issue about the way in which W3C standards have as a condition of their adoption to be royalty-free, which is actually you might argue this is either an extraordinary example of corporate benevolence, that corporate members would allow this to happen, but in fact it was a drag-out, knockdown fight that happened where the W3C had a very, and by W3C I mean the staff of the W3C, had a very extensive and energetic debate with various large corporate interests before they arrived at the royalty-free settlement. And in fact a lot of that was negotiated by Danny Weitzner, who now of course sits inside the White House, and actually, interestingly, is responsible for the White House's privacy policies at the moment. So Danny goes from P3P right through to the White House's self-regulatory solution to privacy that you may or may not be discussing over the next few days. So, but there's also an argument, of course, that actually what's so different about the W3C, at least it's open about its corporate member interests. Whereas if you look at the IETF, yes, there are also dominant corporate interests. And the argument is that even here, they can free ride and otherwise game the system for stockholders' benefit, because that's what companies do when they make standards, right? This is not something that's going to shock people who work with the ISO. This is not something that's going to shock people that work with ETSI. This shouldn't be something that shocks us dealing with the IETF or the W3C, right? These are not kind of innocent paragons of virtue. These are standards-making organizations. So we should expect that people want to game the system, and we talk about HTML5, and would it be a surprise to any of us that Microsoft tries to game the system as much as it can do, and we can go through lots of other standards for that, particularly MPEG-4 versus Microsoft's own proprietary standards. But we could also look at the IETF, and there is an interesting history about Cisco's relationship with the IETF and its relationship with multicasting. And you may be familiar with the famous comment that was made when, forgive me if I forget his surname, Harold, is it Alfredson, became the chair of the IETF, replacing Fred Baker at the end of the 20th century, I think it was 99 or 2000. And so Harold took over as the chair of the IETF, and someone said, wow, isn't it impressive that the IETF has a foreigner as its chair? And to which the response was, what do you mean a foreigner? He's still from Cisco, isn't he? Yeah. So, this is not a new thing, and we should be aware that standards organizations work according to the interests of those within the standards organizations. And one cannot, even though we maintain the fiction, one should not and cannot expect that people who are funded to attend IETF meetings as their job and to work on IETF protocols leave their corporate affiliation outside the door. Of course, that's an enjoyable fiction. But of course, it's never worked in that way. No? And I hope this isn't a controversial thing to say. I don't see anyone looking shocked to the core. So, there's an interesting question about the degree to which one could aim particular critiques at the W3C or at the IETF or at any other standards organization for that matter. Jonathan, you have
There's a small thing, which is the extent to which, particularly when you have corporations working on standards that are not directly within their span of control, whether their notion of their interest isn't affected by active participation in the standards bodies. Right? I mean, when we
so
say
the degree to which this
interest,
appears on their radar, even though it's not actually something
part
which
of
they're
it is
actually
salience and
engaged.
attention, but part of it is also the objective function of these corporations. Right? It's an easy and a meaningless thing to say that they maximize profit. Is it profit now? Is it profit then? Is it direct profit from the people you supply service to, or third-party monetization of that relationship? I mean, there are all kinds of, is it taking advantage of people, or is it holding more formal and burdensome and effective regulation in abeyance?
Right.
There are all kinds of ways you can construe what your interest means in terms of these particular actions, and sitting down in a room with a bunch of people is an ace way of changing your perspective on the situation. So I don't think it's a simple dichotomy between the collective interests of doing the standards or these sort of ugly, narrow, and selfish corporate interests.
Right.
Any more than we're all paragons of virtue, right?
No, of course.
Sometimes we align, sometimes it's in a good direction.
And in this case, of course, because because the goals and the results can be so large and so impressive, you can actually get very useful coalition forming both within and across sectors, in contrast to academia, as Henry Kissinger famously said. Okay, so the new paradigm, so now you see why I'm talking about the new thing, because it may turn out the new thing is not quite as new as we thought it was. And so the new paradigms, of course, need to be set against the existing bodies. And this is why we look, for instance, at ETSI, which, of course, is the new method of standard setting from the 1990s. There's a critique of this, of course, in terms of the state firm diplomacy engaged in ETSI. ETSI has a very strong relationship with with what used to, of course, be the state vendors. Of course, these people have changed recently. And hence, this 3G standards paper is interesting in terms of it's a somewhat crude but very effective exposure of the way in which ETSI helped to negotiate the compromise which led to the universal 3G standard, should we say. But is the US any better? And of course that's fascinating because of course Qualcomm has got a very interesting mode of operation and has a very interesting history, of course, as has Motorola. Well, of course, if you trace far enough back, you find all kinds of companies with all kinds of interesting standards backgrounds. And then, of course, we have to look at that against, ETSI is at least a telecom-specific standards body. We can go much more broadly to the ISO, and we've talked about Sun and Java and the relationship with the ISO there. Microsoft and the OOXML discussion, which is apparently, I believe, this is the name of the standard, or the number of the standard. And it's, first of all, it was an ECMA standard. Other people know more about ECMA than I do, but it was just an ECMA standard before it became an ISO standard. And then it became an ISO IEC standard. And there's some interesting work that was done by a brilliant lawyer who's now at the University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, David McGowan, on is there a new way of forming standards between these existing institutions and the new institutions. Very interesting work that was carried out. Okay, I shall move. I was wondering if anyone was going to ask me about the IEC, I was going to tell them all about it, but I think we can move on swiftly from that. There are very old, very august standards institutions. Okay, so how can we modernize how can we come up with a new model? How would we modernize the new models in order to make them more interesting? And so if we say faults in the new models, the IETF and the W3C ones, because as you've just seen, ETSI is the new model. So the IETF and the W3C must be new models. Arguably, I suppose IETF is the new model, and the W3C, because it's formed since the IETF, is the new model, or version 3 of the standard, as it were. So what happens? How do we see this developing? Well, first of all, there is modernization. I don't want to put it too strongly, but it's creeping into the old new models. So the ITU is attempting to reform itself a bit. ISO itself is also trying to become more flexible and develop standards more rapidly. There is a lot, as Joanna said, there is a lot of collaboration taking place between standards bodies. And there was, just last week, I believe it was, there was a new document published by the IETF and the ITU about the way in which they will be collaborating in the future, which is updating their existing kind of memorandum of agreement on how they work. So we do have increased, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but at least think about it, there is increased formal transparency and increased formal multi-stakeholder participation being signaled by the ITU. I don't want to overstate this, but organizations will not talk about their formal models of dialogue or their formal models anymore without saying that they are becoming more transparent and allowing for greater multi-stakeholder participation. Right? They will always say that because this is the new method of talking about your organization. The degree to which that's actually the case and the stage in the cycle at which that's introduced, and as well as the actual persuasiveness of third-party influences over the standards organization, I think is particularly fascinating. And so, of course, the difference between rhetoric and reality is something that we want to explore over the next couple of years. Because I think that will be a very important litmus test for how much standards organizations might be reforming themselves. But then there's another thought, which is a really significant design question, which is that, so there's the first question is whether the new model or new model of the IETF and the W3C is still fit for purpose. And whether or not, because these do not have a very high level of formal multi-stakeholder participation either, from civil society and others. And of course the IETF says, well, we don't need to have a civil society involvement because everybody is welcome to come to IETF meetings in any case. So we don't need to have this formal siloed participation model. But then of course one of the questions is, if you do introduce these further participants, privacy advocates and others. I take it that many people in this room are privacy advocates in their part-time as well as protocol designers. Well, does that offer more transparency? Well, arguably it might do, but does it actually threaten to further ossify the standard design process? One of the most important claims about the new internet standards models, whether it be coalitions between corporations or it be the actual standards institutions themselves, the IETF and the W3, is that they're faster and they make better standards. Right? Judges by our results, judges by our outcomes. If this is going to slow down a process which is already arguably slowing down because of the amount of actors involved just at the corporate or the technical design level, then won't this further slow things down? And will you, if you attempted to reform in order to make the IETF more inclusive, could you simply create a kind of new, kind of monstrous type of ITU organization, which wouldn't have achieved either of your outcome goals, right? Which would no longer be faster and more efficient, and would also have a kind of false legitimacy claim that isn't really backed up by the reality of what's taking place. So this is a really interesting, significant design question. And we will, of course, not be able to crunch numbers and come out with a formal answer to this in 2 years, because this is an ongoing question which will, of course, hopefully never be formally and finally resolved. But it's a very important question. And it's a question that, of course, has been engaged with by the standards bodies themselves for at least a decade, and informally at least much longer than that, because this is a very significant question. And it's not new. I mean, Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, CPSR, dates back to 1992. So for 20 years at least, we've had a lobby within the technical community saying that we are not sufficiently engaged with the kind of human and social elements of design questions, particularly for things like privacy. So, this is not by any means a kind of new issue on the agenda. That may well be. Yes, let me just say, one of the important things about having these case studies, of course, is about the explanatory power that comes from having a sufficiently representative number of of case studies. And so these are the questions that we're really asking. This is just to give you the formal summary of what we're asking. Questions that go outward towards other sectors, which is that what can we learn from the standards design process that can be transferable outward from internet design to other technological design areas, as well as questions that come inward, which are how we actually improve the internet design process itself. So this hopefully is not simply a closed dialogue, because one of the things, as you can see from the construction of the methodology for this activity, is that we don't want to end up with a closed discussion amongst internet protocol experts saying how wonderful their own particular ways of forming standards are, but to try and adopt a wider perspective that enables us to kind of focus on internet design within a context of wider standards processes. Okay. So, that I think is as far as I got to, and hopefully that will provoke a bit of a discussion. Yes, I'm going to sit down if that's okay.
I'm not sure if it may sound a silly question, but I wonder whose responsibility is to ensure the performance of that standard? I mean, when it's been adopted or when it's been designed, who ensures the performance of that standard? I mean, whose responsibility it should?
So not about the implementation, but about whether the well, I suppose this. Jonathan, you want to have a go at that? 'Cause this is
the first is, other than for engineers, why would one assume either that the standard, that the enforcement of the standard should be the responsibility of any single party, or that it should actually be enforced or complied with at all? It's a rule, and the departures from the rule, when the rule is commonly accepted, the departures are then significant, right? When we put a speed limit on, we don't actually want people to not drive faster than the speed limit. That we could do technically. What we want to do is to filter people. So the only ones who drive faster are the ones whose, as it were, willingness to pay, because someone's giving birth in the seat next to them, is sufficient to justify that departure from the norm. So in that sense, as a social mechanism, they may not need that. However, on the other hand, to make people feel that they are responsible for implementing the standards is a very useful discipline device, and a device to invite participation and co-creation of an understanding of what the standard does. So in that sense, because these are self-organized things, it may be that the only proper answer to your quite good question is everybody, the system itself, jointly and severally. And if they don't get implemented, in some sense, well, I'm an economist, I'd say it's because they shouldn't be implemented. Right? It's how you can tell whether they're any good. But no, I mean, they're not law. If they needed to be law, then presumably there's a process by which they would become law. In the sense that someone is responsible.
I didn't talk much about the way in which governments get involved in the process, and of course there are various ways in which governments can involve themselves in standards processes. One is, of course, as an observer status. Then, of course, there can be an involvement in the creation of the forum in which the standards are actually created. People probably may not know, but the W3C was actually founded with some European Commission money. This was by no means the entirety of the money, but the European Commission funded the European partner of the W3C originally. And the W3 itself was announced, it was formally brought to the world in an announcement at the European Commission's offices in Brussels in 1994. So there can be that kind of involvement in the creation of the forum that enables the standards body to go forward. But of course there can also be involvement in the formal adoption of a standard, or the formal adoption of the formal sanction, as it were, or the formal acceptance of the standards body as a legitimate body to make those standards. Right? So government may not involve, and I think you may hope that government doesn't involve itself in individual standards unless it really feels a very pressing market failure would otherwise happen. But government can involve itself to the extent of saying, we accept that this standards body has the requisite degree of legitimacy and transparency and kind of process efficiency, in other words, that the standards it comes up with are actually useful, that we will give credence to this standards body's outcomes. So that can mean one of two things. Either they give a kind of, as it were, an official sanction for the outcome of the standards process, or it could well be, at a minimum level, we won't be bringing a competition lawsuit against this cartel, right? That's the very basic level of saying, this standards body is not going to be sued because we've decided that its outcomes are sufficiently transparent that we've decided it's not simply a producer cartel which is coming up with something anti-competitive. So there are all kinds of ways in which government can get involved in the process as well. And of course there are processes in terms of implementation and other things as well that it can get involved in. But was your question more about who makes sure that the thing actually works?
Sure. For example, in terms of the telecom standards, people who use those standards probably don't know much details about these standards. For example, there is a regulatory body in some countries which regulates the GSM, like in Pakistan, for example. And there's a certain clause that says no foreign company should operate in Pakistan unless they would provide lawful interception system to the law enforcement agencies. My question would be, for example, I being a user, right, of that standard system, doesn't know what lawful interception system is taking information of me. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Yeah.
So is there an international standard for the type of surveillance which is
yes, exactly.
required by the government of Pakistan?
I mean, shouldn't the people who use these technologies should be aware of such systems?
This is also very important because if a company from North America or Europe is intending to sell such systems to the government of Pakistan or Egypt or any other government, then there is increasing political and legal pressure being placed upon them to ensure that the systems they're selling conform to the both technical and political standards which are expected. In other words, that they can. In other words, they are capable of a particular type of surveillance, but not another type.
I'm sure every country would have such systems, but
actually, that brings up a couple of really interesting aspects I hadn't personally thought about before. The first is, when Chris was talking about how governments can be involved, I could imagine governments supporting standards by doing things out with the standards process. For example, by mandating a given standard or equivalent performance in public procurement, which in Europe is an enormous thing, particularly on certain systems, or by building the standards into the way you allocate spectrum, for example. So, WiMAX LTE, all the 2.6 gigahertz stuff is not neutral with regard to what are ultimately technical standards rather than technologies. On the other hand, they will recognize that, so that is giving color and protection to the interests of the people who did the standard setting process themselves, the corporates, for example, who did this, and saying this is okay because it offers certain advantages, and the EC's position regarding framework-type research projects, that you should standardize as early as possible and in as European-specific a way as possible, is of that nature. But then there's the flip side of it, which is governments using the standards process as cover for something that they wish to do anyway. Chris used the term political standards. Obviously, the participation, transparency, and all the rest of it requirements for a political standard-setting process, because it comes so close to government and democracy and all those kinds of things, are vastly different from anything any of these bodies comprise, even W3C. Right? They don't give democratic legitimacy. They don't have the same degree because they don't address a population that's capable of supporting that. But things like, if we do come on to talk about ACTA or SOPA or things like that, we will certainly see questions as to whether a deep packet inspection is a legitimate thing to bundle together with a standard or accommodate within a standard, given this kind of fig leaf of intellectual property protection, when really what they want to do is to beak into all of our traffic in a nasty way. So I think that's an interesting thing, because so you have methods and you have objectives on both, let's say, the civil society side, on the business side, and the administrative side, and they all kind of get cross-linked together. And that's why I say I don't know how to drill down below saying it's all of them together.
And when it comes to surveillance standards, of course, the European Commission has given itself to having to make the judgment about what is a good and bad surveillance standard to implement, not inside the European Union, although there are other standards for that, but outside the European Union. And that's because they've decided that there should be export controls on particular surveillance equipment being sold to particular regimes, and also that they will fund surveillance evading technologies within the no disconnect strategy, which I know people are familiar with it. The Commission is allocating quite a substantial amount of money to the to helping the creation and dissemination of anti-surveillance tools to be used by pro-democracy advocates in third countries.
Well, to be used by anyone who wants to,
Yeah.
because you can't actually say, "Are you a pro-democracy advocate? Show me your card." Because I
And we shall
say-
publish it on the website that you
Right.
are such a person.
The spearhead of this the spokesman for this no disconnect strategy happens to be our project officer in the
Yeah.
EINS project, and this is something very close to his heart. But Chris is quite right. Within a Europe which wants to make warehouses of all the point-to-point traffic, or which is currently doing that on certain kinds of traffic, and where some member states, including the one in which we're currently sitting, would like to extend this to all forms of internet traffic, sort of archiving who's talked to whom about what. So you have that kind of total information awareness light standard within Europe, and then outside Europe, no other government that isn't European should be able to look at anything. It is rather peculiar. It's like free trade.
And it's interesting, actually, the Chinese government minister responsible for this policy has talked about Europe converging on a more Asian approach to information control, and has specifically talked about the British government's policies towards information, towards interception and lawful surveillance. So this is if you like, and this is to slightly extend the standards analogy, the standard of governance of information surveillance is something which governments are acutely aware of what other governments are doing in this area and of what their corporations are doing.
So in a sense, you're saying that our expectations, for example, as to what is public space and what is private space, constitute a standard which is in flux.
You mean consumers'
Yeah,
expectations?
no, citizens.
Right.
Not consumers.
Right.
I mean,
An economist
you-
has just told a lawyer to use the word citizen, not consumer, which is...
yeah,
I feel
because I don't want
I'm
to be
I'm
responsible for
chastened.
anything I say. But if you walk down the street, for example, unless you're wearing a niqab, people can see your face, right? You have consented
Right.
to letting people see your face. You may or may not have consented to face recognition software and emotional analysis of your tone of voice and things like that.
Mhm.
But that is public space, and we have a not legal, but a de facto standard expectation as to what public space brings with it.
Mhm.
And what spaces. So the thing about, for example, Amazon buying those military surveillance cameras to do their 3D mapping of people's houses, well, that's okay because we have a convention that says that you can always draw your curtains, and if you've got your curtains open, then people can peek into your window as long as they don't stick anything into your house. But that's not necessarily true with skylights, right? So we have to keep pushing these things all the time, and the technology sort of helps to articulate that. So all this stuff about Google Street View and things like that, these are, it seems to me, an evolution of either our convention as to where private and public space stop, or as to what you can do in public space or what you can do in private space. And because they're not laws, but because they need to be relatively common knowledge, why not call them standards?
Right, and this is where privacy becomes a particularly interesting area to look at standards, simply because we make political, social, economic, legal assumptions about what standard of privacy should be permitted to the citizen, which may be entirely at variance with the technical standards which have already been created, let alone those that are being created now, and where, of course, there is a different set of incentives for corporates and governments than there may be for citizens. But I think Runa from Tor is coming in tomorrow, so
Right.
so you can get a much more focused perspective on that tomorrow. We probably haven't answered your question, have we? we've answered a set of other questions that we were interested in, but we may not have answered your one, so apologies if that's what's happened.
I have a question. How many iterations of the word new are required before you get a phrase equaling old?
I think that the use of the word new in connection with policy, as a formal description of policy, is invites ridicule.
Well, what I was thinking was ontogeny recapitulates...
Gentle
Yeah.
satire.
I was thinking of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, right? That we've gone on long journeys around things like interoperability, competition, privacy. And we seem to have created, so we address the issue, we create some institutions around that addressing of the issue. The institutions sort of creep out or become hollowed out, and then the issues resurface and need to be addressed again.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sense in which we're just repeating cycles. It's always new, but like in the Greek myths, like only 7 stories. And this is one of them.
One of the interesting things about terming a policy new as opposed to using a more descriptive term is that, of course, you're not tied to whether or not it's actually succeeded in what you're claiming for it. So if we were to say, okay, 2012 we're going to create a more participative form of standard setting, then we could actually judge somebody against whether or not this really has got more meaningful participation or not, or maybe more meaningless participation or not. So I think that's kind of a nice way to label it. I didn't mention anything about, and maybe I should have done, that there was a couple of European policy approaches to follow if you're interested in this area. The first is that we have something called a European interoperability framework that some of you might be familiar with, which is now in version 2.0. So that's the new European interoperability framework. And this is now being adopted. And it talks about things like procurement, government procurement should always be biased in favour of open standards and interoperable standards as opposed to proprietary standards, unless the procurers can provide a very strong reason why they should stick with proprietary standards. And so this is, if you like, an attempt to answer the Microsoft question. You know, why is everyone buying Microsoft software all the time in government? Why is this taking place? The second part, which is very interesting, is that the Commission, and driven very much by the European Parliament, is bringing in new rules about the way in which they want to see standards-making procedures operate. And the Parliament has actually introduced a measure which ensures that SMEs, small businesses, are actually financially supported if they wish to engage in standards-making processes. And so this is a kind of a real commitment. Oh, I don't know how real it is, but at least it's a financial commitment to saying we accept that standards making is an involved and expensive process, both in time and in the effort needed to actually attend meetings, and that SMEs should actually be receive essentially their costs if they want to engage in standards making processes. Which is interesting because, of course, that answers one of the questions you asked about standards, which is how can small companies ever become involved in standards making? Or how can academics ever fund their trips to IETF meetings?
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
He said you have a public and a private space, even personally as a citizen, and everywhere in the world, of course. But if you see, in Germany you had this Google stuff, which is more often saying no, we don't want that, and so they even said, okay, we won't ever do that. So we won't have any Google Street View anymore in Germany, which I personally do like, but 90% do not. But if you say you want all these small companies, and even then you can say, why not every citizen gets involved, which is a natural question which arises. Does it make any sense to have an organization then? Then we have, at least in the old internet days, some emergent anyway, so we can drop all standardization organizations then. I mean, what emerges will be used, like the internet. It's not good, but it's there, and it will stay like that.
Well, then perhaps instead of thrones and powers, these organizations are simply intermediaries. Right? They provide certain economies of scale and scope and visibility, but they have no power, no formal power, not even market power. Because I think you're absolutely right. A business is a legal entity. It's a legal person, and natural persons also have powers of personhood, self-determination, and participation, right? And participation is not, I think, an unalloyed good thing. Like, more participation is always better. And the way you set up the body will determine who wishes to participate. You can always clog up any situation by participation. I mean, look at what's happened to Europe in the last decade. They've had more or less issues that more or less equally divided the population. And country after country after country has produced governments with no mandate that can't do anything. And I don't think that was ever intended, but it certainly has been quite obviously the case in Greece, in Italy, in Germany, in France, and in the UK. So it's not obvious that the things that are good in small doses would be good in large doses, but some of these distinctions may be artifacts of a certain period of time and may need to go away. And maybe the Constitution, well, actually it happened with some of the standards bodies, right? As Chris said, they got big, they got slow, they got old. Their standards became so high level that they had no content, and new things had to spring up to do the standards that really mattered. At least that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the IETF wasn't deliberately created as a. Actually, I think it was more or less deliberately created as a reaction to the ITU. But you had a question?
People actually who create these standards have more stakeholders from the European and US sides of it. But the people who actually use these standards, if you look at it, the people from the larger population of these people who use these standards are from India and China. Don't you think these standard, the people who create this standard are creating a digital divide? Because there are not many people who, in the other side, the European Union and US, who would actually use this standard, adopt this standard. Rather, the people in, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but
well, a classic example.
A digital divide. The people, the users will be more user base will be more in India and China.
Well, a classic example is that the original standard for IPv6, which of course would have revealed the IP address of those who are using IPv6 as an automatic configuration. Of course, where's IPv6 being used?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting example of that. I don't know if that's the kind of example you were thinking of, because obviously there are privacy implications associated with that if that was the standard that you were to adopt. And of course, that's been adopted much more broadly in East Asia than it has been in the West, not particularly North America.
I mean, what I think the participation of these standard-making process should be more global in a sense, rather than. Do you think they're more global?
Well, look at the people who run countries and pass laws. They're not generally in their first flower of youth, and they're not generally drawn from the poor parts of the population. So it is as if the making of rules is something that happens later in your life, whether life is economic life or just the life cycle of countries. So in that sense, it's not so much that it's the EU and the US, but it's the waning economies who led the last wave of economic development, codifying the lessons of that experience for use and adaptation by the next wave. Within the EU itself, we have that. It's the acquis communautaire. It was a bunch of rules drawn up by the countries that had made it, the original EU 15, drew these things up, and the new member states, bless them, tried to use them as a blueprint, as if we do this, then it'll be okay. Well, it didn't really work out that way. So maybe it's just a life cycle thing. And actually, when the BRICS or whatever spelling, if that acronym we have is the BICS or whatever, when they get old, they too will begin to make standards.
But the lack of participation that you talk about, of course, I mean, there are many valid claims for participation from outside the technical community. And when this was first explored, I think, or really exposed within a project, the Centre for Democracy and Technology in the States, I think it was, conducted a project on standards making 10 or 11 years ago, and received some really strong criticism from the IETF when they suggested that the IETF wasn't embracing the concerns of the global south, civil society, human rights activists, and so on. And at that point, there was very little dialogue about a lack of representation that you talk about. But then the danger is, where do you actually draw the line, right? How many parties do you involve in the process, and does it become ossified as a result of, involving these terrible privacy advocates in privacy standards could result in, a standard which corporates weren't interested in. And so you have these this weird engagement. Was it last year where Facebook decided to invite 20 privacy advocates to come and talk to Mark Zuckerberg about what their concerns were about Facebook? And it emerged that their concerns actually would have impacted directly on the profits of Facebook, which led to a difficult discussion about what future standards the community might adopt.
I guess that's an issue we may come back to on whether the goal of participation is coverage or representativeness. Right? I mean, as you mentioned with the weighted majority rule thing, for example, there is the question about why we would need to have many representatives of a particular perspective or point of view. Why isn't it enough, for example, that Europe can represent the interests of Europe and the US and so on? Certainly on particular standards, that would be the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have a common corporate culture, even though it transcends national boundaries. They are basically saying the same thing, and we don't need to have it said 500 times to the exclusion of all others. It's one of the problems with multi-stakeholderism in the internet governance space.
Right.
That civil society is this little brand, and if you're inside the brand, you can be politely ignored in your designated slot for being politely ignored, and the rest of you can go fly a kite. And,
I didn't talk, by the way, about the OECD and the IGF, but obviously we will be looking at those as examples of governance rather than necessarily standards making. I mean, the OECD does do some standards making, but really in the area of corporate responsibility, which has a very tangential relationship with technical standards, but is nevertheless of interest. And this means, what should a multinational do when it's required to breach the freedom of expression or privacy of its customers in a particular country? Which is an interesting example of how standards can stretch right into areas far removed from what the technical community thinks of as being where standards are made. It is just about coffee time. And I felt a lull about a minute ago that said people were going, it's 11:15, haven't got caffeine. So should we wrap this session and move on to the next? When are we coming back? 11:30, Monica? 11:30? All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.